There's a specific kind of feeling you get when you rewatch a show you already know everything about. It's a bit different from watching it for the first time, obviously, but it's also different from just nostalgia. It's more like you're reading a letter again after you know how the relationship turned out. You're noticing all the things that were there from the beginning, just quietly waiting for you to understand them. Steven Universe is one of those shows. I rewatched the first season a while after everything had been revealed, and the experience was genuinely a little unsettling in the best possible way. Things that seemed like throwaway visual gags in 2013 turned out to be meticulously placed foreshadowing. Background details that didn't register the first time were suddenly impossible to ignore. It's a show that rewards patience in a very particular way. Not because it's withholding information to frustrate you, but because it has an enormous amount of story to tell and it trusted its audience to be paying attention, and a lot of people were paying attention. Obsessively so. The Steven Universe fan community during the show's run was one of the most dedicated theory crafting communities I've ever seen. People were pulling frame by frame analysis out of brief background murals. They were cross-referencing gem geology with character personalities. They were arguing about the implications of musical motifs showing up in unexpected scenes. Some of it was wrong, some of it was incredibly, almost eerily right in ways that made you wonder if the crew was reading the forums. What's interesting about the show's production history is that Rebecca Sugar and her team were clearly thinking about the full arc of the story from very early on. The show went through years of network-related difficulties, hiatuses that frustrated the audience, shorter episode runs than the story needed, an accelerated ending that left several threads less complete than they might otherwise have been, and yet the core architecture held. The things that were planted in Season 1 still paid off in Season 5. The foreshadowing still landed. Whatever pressures the show was under externally, the internal logic remained intact. That's not accidental. That's careful, committed craftsmanship. There's also something I want to get into before we go any further, which is the show's relationship to its themes. Steven Universe is, at its most basic level, a show about a child who inherits an enormous amount of other people's history and has to figure out what to do with it. He didn't choose his parents. He didn't choose the war. He didn't choose the Gem Empire or its aftermath or the specific weight of being Rose Quartz's son. He was just born into all of it and spent his childhood and young adulthood and the stretch of time that future covers working out who he is inside all of that inheritance. That's a story that resonates with a lot of people in ways that go beyond space rocks and magical powers. Most of us inherit things we didn't choose. Family patterns, historical weight, the particular emotional weather of the household we grew up in. Steven Universe takes that experience and scales it up to a cosmic level without losing what it feels like from the inside, which is probably why it has the fandom it has, and why the theories are still being written years after the finale. What I want to do tonight is just wander through some of it. The big unanswered questions. The theories that were almost confirmed. The threads the show left deliberately open and the ones it sort of dropped without ceremony. There's no particular order to any of this, and I'm not going to pretend there are definitive answers to most of it. A lot of what makes Steven Universe interesting is exactly the fact that it leaves space for interpretation. The show was made by someone who understood that mystery isn't just a storytelling device. Sometimes the mystery is the point. So if you're settled in and you want something to think about while you drift off, this is what we're doing tonight. One small thing before we start. Some of what we'll talk about has been officially resolved by the show, confirmed in canon, settled. Some of it was theorized by the fan community and turned out to be right. Some of it is still genuinely open. And the honest answer is that we'll never know for certain. I'll try to be clear about which is which as we go. But I don't think the distinction matters as much as it might seem. The theories that turned out to be wrong are sometimes more interesting than the facts that replaced them. The questions the show deliberately left open are often more alive than the ones it answered. This is a show that earns your trust and then uses it to invite you into a kind of comfortable uncertainty. The kind that doesn't need to be resolved to be enjoyable. So, a magical pink lion, an unopened chest, a diamond who became a revolutionary, a pearl who carried a secret for thousands of years, a small boy who inherited all of it and had to figure out what to do with it. Let's take it from the beginning. Steven Universe introduces a lot of strange things without explanation. That's part of its texture. But most of those things eventually get explained, or at least addressed. There's one major exception, and his name is Lion. Lion just shows up. That's genuinely the introduction. Steven finds a large pink lion in the desert sometime during the first season, and the lion decides to follow him home, and that's that. No one acts particularly surprised. No one explains where he came from. He's just there now. This enormous pink magical cat who understands everything Steven says, and can apparently do several things that should not be physically possible. To give you a sense of the list, Lion can run across the surface of the ocean without sinking. He can roar with enough force to send shockwaves through solid objects. He can open portals by roaring, portals that are apparently stable enough to travel through. And most significantly, he has a pocket dimension inside his mane. A whole space you can step into with grass, a tree, and the collected belongings of Rose Quartz, her sword, a VHS tape she made for Steven, her battle flag, a photograph of her and Greg, a few other odds and ends. It's a room that doesn't exist inside a lion. And somehow, this is not the most mysterious thing about him. The earliest real clue about Lion's origins comes from the 4th season episode Buddy's Book, when Steven and Connie find the travel journal of Buddy Budwick, an explorer from what appears to be the 19th century. In it, Buddy describes encountering Rose Quartz in a desert, living among a pride of lions. One of those lions is described and sketched in a way that clearly resembles lion, same build, same general features, except his fur is the normal color for a lion. And he doesn't appear to have any powers, so at some point between Buddy's journal and Steven finding him in the desert, something happened to this lion that turned him pink and gave him a pocket dimension in his mane and the ability to warp across vast distances by yelling. The show's eventual explanation, given quietly, not dramatically, is that Rose brought him back to life after he died. She had healing powers. Those powers, when applied to a living creature near death, apparently had an extraordinary effect. Lion wasn't created. He was transformed by being brought back. The show confirmed this in a fairly indirect way, mostly through dialogue and the fact that Lars, who dies briefly in Season 5 and is brought back by Steven, ends up with nearly identical abilities: pink hair, pocket dimension in his head, the ability to open portals. Lars becomes a sort of second Lion, which is how the show quietly tells you what Lion is without ever delivering a proper explanation scene. That's satisfying as far as it goes, but it doesn't explain everything, and the fan community spent years going significantly deeper. One of the more compelling theories that circulated before any of the Lars revelation involved music. The show uses musical themes and instrumentation quite deliberately. Each major character or character type has associated musical elements. Pearls are associated with piano, amethyst with drums, gems from the Diamond Authority's court, and diamonds themselves tend to be associated with synthesizer tones. It's not always obvious, but it's consistent enough that the fan community started mapping it out quite thoroughly. And when Lion warps, when he opens a portal, the sound effect contains a synthesizer tone that matches diamond musical themes. If you're not listening for it, you'll miss it. But once you hear it, it's difficult to unhear. The portal itself in several frames contains what appears to be a very brief diamond shape. The theory that built on this was that Lion isn't just a lion brought back from the dead by Rose's healing power. He's a lion brought back using energy connected to pink diamond specifically. That some fragment of Pink's power, or Pink's shards, was woven into him. This was never confirmed. The show moved on. But the evidence is sitting there in the audio, and the writers were careful enough about musical themes that it's hard to dismiss it as accident. What we do know is that Rose clearly had a profound relationship with Lion, and that relationship predates Steven by decades at minimum. She wanted a friend who didn't know who she used to be. That's the closest thing we get to an explanation of why Rose would make something like Lion. She'd spent thousands of years as Pink Diamond, then thousands more as Rose Quartz, constantly carrying the weight of her own history. A companion who simply accepted her. without any knowledge of or opinion about what she'd done. There's something very understandable about wanting that. Lion eventually chooses Stephen in the same uncomplicated way, which is either just a lovely character detail, or it's the show quietly saying that the thing Rose built for herself, a relationship without baggage, became the thing she left her son. And then there's the chest. Inside Lion's mane, among all the things that eventually got explained, the sword, the tape, Bismuth's gem, the photo, there is a small wooden treasure chest. Stephen tried to open it once in the episode Lion 4, Alternate Ending, and couldn't figure out how, and then gave up and never tried again. And then no one tried again, ever. In the movie, if you're watching carefully, the chest is still there in the mane, and it now has vines growing on it. Still locked. Still unexplained. We'll come back to the chest properly in a bit, but I want to mention it here because it's inseparable from the question of Lion. Whatever is in that chest is presumably something Rose chose to put in there for a reason. It's the one thing in the mane that hasn't been accounted for. And the fact that it's still locked suggests either that whatever's inside isn't urgent, or that Stephen didn't think to go back for it. Or, and this is the reading I find most interesting, that the right moment to open it simply hadn't arrived before the show ended. There's something I genuinely like about Lion as a mystery. Most of the show's big questions have answers, even if those answers raise new questions. Lion is one of the few things that feels like it sits in a permanently comfortable space of we mostly know, and we don't quite know. He's a magical pink lion who loved Rose and then loved Stephen, and he can open portals and run on water, and there's a room in his head where Rose kept her sword. That's enough to work with. The deeper question of exactly what he is made of, energetically, is the kind of thing the show trusts you to sit with. There's also something about Lion I keep coming back to. The way the show communicates his relationship with Stephen. Lion doesn't choose Stephen the way a pet chooses an owner. It's a more lateral kind of choice, more like recognition than attachment. When Lion keeps following Stephen home, keeps showing up when Stephen needs something, keeps providing access to the things Rose left behind, there's a quality to it that feels deliberate on Lion's part, in a way that's slightly uncanny. He's not waiting for Stephen to catch up to him. He seems to already know where Stephen is going. Whether that's because Rose somehow encoded something like that into Lion's understanding, or whether Lion is simply smart enough to read the situation. Another thing the show never fully explains is the extent of his intelligence. He clearly understands language. He responds to complex instructions. In several episodes, he acts on information he couldn't have obtained by conventional means, arriving in the right place at the right time in ways that suggest either extraordinary intuition or something more structured. The show never confirms which. It's content to let Lion be wise in the way that animals in stories are sometimes wise, without ever reducing that wisdom to a mechanism. And there's something almost comforting in that ambiguity, especially in the context of a show that's fundamentally about inheritance and legacy and the things parents leave behind for their children. Lion is the most material gift Rose left Stephen. He's also the most mysterious. He predates Stephen. He knew Rose. He holds her things, and yet he transferred his loyalty to Stephen completely and apparently without reservation, as though that was always the point. I find it easier to sit with Lion's mysteries than with most of the show's other open questions. The chest bothers me more. It's the kind of thing that implies an answer exists somewhere. Lion himself just is. He's a pink lion with a magic mane and a complicated past and genuine affection for a boy who needed a friend that didn't come with history attached. You can decide if you want that the diamond synth and his warp sound is meaningful, or you can decide it isn't. Either way, he's walking on water, and that's already quite a lot. I find not everything needs to be resolved. Not every door needs to be opened. Some things are just there, being what they are. And the grace of the show is that it seems to understand that. Let me tell you what we know is in Lion's mane, just to make the chest feel properly strange by comparison. Rose's sword is in there. The sword that Pearl, her Pearl, once used to stage the shattering of Pink Diamond. That one has an entire history attached to it that the show takes its time unraveling. Bismuth's gem was in there, bubbled, hidden away after Rose poofed her and couldn't bring herself to tell anyone why. The VHS tape is in there. The message Rose recorded for Stephen before he was born, full of things she wanted him to know, and a few things she conspicuously decided not to say. A flag with Rose's sigil, a photograph of Rose and Greg, young and in love. Greg with the kind of hair that suggests the late 1980s. A Mr. Universe t-shirt, which is a detail that's quietly devastating. When you understand their relationship, all of it explained, all of it part of the story. Every item in that main was a breadcrumb. By the time the show ended, you could trace each one back to a specific piece of Rose Quartz's history. And then there's the small wooden chest sitting in the corner, covered in vines by the time of the movie, locked. No explanation given. No one has tried to open it since Stephen's first attempt. The episode built around it, Lion 4, alternate ending, is actually a lovely piece of writing, because it's about Stephen expecting some grand revelation about his destiny and finding out that the chest won't open and that Lion is just a lion and that maybe his destiny is just to be himself. It's one of those episodes where the anticlimax is the point, except the chest is still there afterwards, still physically present, still locked. The show uses it as a background prop across multiple episodes, and if you're paying attention, you notice it every single time. It has a presence, it's doing something simply by being unopened in a room full of things that have been explained. The fandom's theories about what's inside break into a few general camps, and none of them are verifiable. One of the most popular ideas is that it contains something specifically meant for Stephen, a parallel to the VHS tape, but physical. A letter, or an object, or something Rose kept back because she wanted him to discover it when he was ready, not from watching a tape at age 13. The VHS tape is full of things Rose wanted Stephen to know. The chest might be full of things Rose wanted him to have. The key, literally and metaphorically, might be something Stephen had to grow into. And the show ended before he got there. Another theory connects the chest to Greg specifically. Rose kept a lot of things relating to Greg. The photograph, the shirt, clearly a whole sentimental relationship with his life before Stephen. The idea here is that some part of her time with Greg, some physical memento or letter, ended up in that chest, something too personal to leave in the open. Something Greg maybe doesn't even know exists. There's a more esoteric reading that connects the vines on the chest in the movie to Spinel's garden. In the movie, Pink Diamond's abandoned garden, where Spinel stood motionless for thousands of years waiting for a pink who never came back, is covered in similar vines. The visual echo might be purely aesthetic, just the movie's production design, applying a consistent botanical texture to pink, diamond-adjacent spaces. Or it might be meaningful. If the chest contains something from Pink Diamond life before Earth, before Rose Quartz, before any of it, something from the very beginning, then the vines might be making a connection the show never quite spelled out. Rebecca Sugar has spoken in various interviews over the years about the intentional gaps in the show's narrative. Her instinct was never to over-explain. Steven Universe is a show about how the past shapes the present and about the things people carry without fully understanding what they're carrying. A locked chest in a magical pocket dimension left by a woman who kept secrets from nearly everyone she loved. That's almost too on the nose as a symbol. But the show trusts its symbols. It doesn't feel the need to crack everyone open. What I find most affecting about the chest is that it's such a specific kind of mystery. It's not a mystery about the history of the universe or the nature of gem society or the origin of white diamond. It's a small personal mystery. It's the kind of thing a parent leaves behind that a child might spend years wondering about. Stephen's relationship with Rose Quartz is, at its core, a story about growing up in the shadow of someone you never met but who shaped everything about you. The chest is a perfect physical embodiment of that dynamic. He never opened it. Maybe that's fine. Maybe the point of some things isn't it to be opened. Or maybe somewhere after the van drove away from Beach City at the end of Future, he pulled over on some highway and figured it out. There's also the question of what locked means in this context. Lion's Mane is a pocket dimension with no obvious rules about what belongs there. Rose could put things in and take them out as she chose. The chest is locked in a conventional sense. Stephen couldn't open it with his hands, couldn't find an obvious mechanism. But the show doesn't tell us whether the lock is physical or something else entirely. Whether it requires a specific gem ability or a specific emotional state, or simply a key that's somewhere in the real world if you know where to look. The detail that strikes me most about the Lion 4 episode is that Stephen spends it searching for a hidden destiny and finds the chest, which won't open, and a lion who is simply a lion. The conclusion he reaches that he doesn't need a special purpose, that being himself is enough, is emotionally satisfying and thematically correct. It's one of the show's clearest statements about Stephen's journey. But the chest is still locked at the end of that episode. The show uses it to make a point about not needing a destiny, and then the chest continues to exist as an object that implies there's something inside it. Those two things exist in a slight tension that the show never quite resolves. I've thought about what would feel right as an answer. If I'm being honest, the theory I find most emotionally resonant is that the chest contains something from Greg. Not a letter, exactly. More like an object. Something Greg gave Rose before Stephen was born. Something personal. Something that represented the human side of the family Stephen came from. Rose kept so much of her gem past in that mane. It would make sense for her to also keep something of the human present she chose. But I hold that theory loosely. The show earned the right to leave this one unanswered. It's not the kind of mystery that demands resolution. It's the kind that's almost more meaningful as a question. The thing about Pink Diamond is that the show spent the better part of 5 seasons building her into a villain, and then very quietly revealed that she was something much more complicated and much more difficult to categorize than that. Not a villain, exactly. Not a hero. Not even quite a tragic figure in the traditional sense, because she didn't simply suffer. She also caused suffering, quite a lot of it, in ways that were sometimes thoughtless and sometimes worse than thoughtless. She was the youngest diamond, smaller than the others, both literally and in terms of authority. Her mural in the moon base, which the show drops very briefly in a second season episode and then doesn't explain for 3 more years, shows her depicted in a much grander, more imposing style than she apparently actually looked. The propaganda version of Pink Diamond was fierce and tall and imposing. The real Pink Diamond was, by diamond standards, almost compact. The mural was making her look powerful in the way that murals of rulers have always been used to make rulers look powerful, which is to say, it was compensating. There's a moment, shown in a flashback, where Pink is granted her colony and she reacts with what looks like uncomplicated excitement. This is what she wanted. This is finally happening. She gets to be a real diamond now with a real planet and real gems and a real court. And then she arrives on Earth and realizes what running a colony actually involves, which is the systematic destruction of everything she finds beautiful about it. That reversal is the engine of her entire story. She wanted the colony. She got the colony. The colony turned out to require something she couldn't do. The show is sympathetic to her in this because the situation was genuinely unjust. She was given authority over a planet and then told she had no authority to make meaningful decisions about that planet. But the show is also clear that her situation, however unjust, was not unique. The gems who were actually being driven into the ground, literally, by the kindergarten process, those beings had it worse. The organic life that was being destroyed had it worse. Pink was constrained. They were obliterated. And her eventual rebellion, for all that it came from genuine love of Earth, still didn't save everyone. The corruption happened anyway. The cluster was planted anyway. The war had costs that outlasted the rebellion by millennia. What the show doesn't answer is what Pink would have done if the war had gone differently. If the rebellion had succeeded more cleanly. If the diamonds had retreated and the corruption never happened. Would Rose Quartz have become something stable and lasting? Would Pink Diamond have stayed gone? Would she eventually have had to reckon publicly with who she was and what she'd done? The counterfactual doesn't get explored because history moved another way, but it's an interesting space to sit in. On a quiet night, thinking about who people might have become under different conditions. She wanted a colony. She'd been asking for one for what sounds like an extraordinarily long time, and Yellow and Blue Diamond kept telling her she wasn't ready, kept treating her as the youngest sibling who needed to prove herself. There's something very recognizable about that dynamic, actually. Being the youngest in a family of powerful beings who all think they know better than you, who grant you things on a timeline determined by their comfort rather than your readiness. It's not hard to feel for her, even before you know what happens next. When Earth was finally given to her, Pink discovered the problem with getting what you want, when what you want turns out to require something you're not willing to do. Earth was full of life, organic, evolving, weird, wonderful life. And the gem colonization process, the kindergarten system that would incubate new gems from the planet's minerals, would kill all of it. Pink asked Yellow and Blue to spare the Earth. They said no. She asked again. They said no again. She tried making a terrifying version of herself appear on the Diamond's communication screen, hoping to scare them into reconsidering. They said no again, and scolded her for the attempt. And then she had an idea. The idea was to pretend to be shattered, to stage her own death with the help of her pearl, so convincingly that the other diamonds would believe there was nothing left of Pink Diamond, and would abandon Earth entirely. No Pink Diamond, no colony, no reason to continue. It was, in retrospect, an enormous gamble built on several assumptions that turned out to be wrong. The most catastrophic of those wrong assumptions was that Yellow and Blue would simply grieve and move on. They didn't. They were devastated in a way that apparently neither Pink nor anyone else had quite anticipated, and their grief curdled into something else, into the decision to unleash a wave of corrupting light on everything left on Earth, as a kind of terrible final act of mourning and revenge. Pink had given up her identity to save the planet, and had accidentally triggered the corruption of nearly every gem on it. Before any of that, though, there's Spinel. Spinel was created for Pink Diamond thousands of years before Earth was even a thought. White Diamond had taken Pink's first pearl. We'll get to that properly later. And as a sort of replacement, a companion for the young Diamond, Pink was given a Spinel, a gem designed to be fun and entertaining and boundlessly enthusiastic, a playmate. And by all accounts, for a long time, they were genuinely happy together. Pink and Spinel played in a private garden. They made up games. It was probably the happiest and most uncomplicated period of Pink Diamond's life, which was otherwise defined by being treated as less than by the beings who were supposed to be her family. But Pink grew up in whatever way a diamond grows up. She started wanting to be taken seriously. Spinel's constant energy and cheerfulness, which had once been comforting, started to feel like an obstacle. A reminder of childishness at a time when Pink needed to prove she was ready for real responsibility. When Pink was finally granted Earth as her colony, she left Spinel in the garden. She told her, "It was a game. Stand perfectly still and wait for me to come back. And it'll be a wonderful game." And then she never came back. Spinel stood motionless in that garden for 6,000 years. There are forget-me-nots planted throughout Pink's garden. I don't know if that was a deliberate choice by the production design team or a coincidence, but I choose to believe it was deliberate because it's the sort of detail that makes you put the remote down for a moment. The pattern here, and it is a pattern, is that Pink Diamond loved people genuinely and warmly, and was also consistently incapable of letting that love be the last word. She moved on from Spinel. She kept enormous secrets from Pearl, the one being who had agreed to help her at great personal cost. She never told Garnet, or Amethyst, or Bismuth, or Greg who she really was. She gave Stephen a video message full of things she wanted him to know, and then conspicuously left out the most important parts. She chose freedom over honesty repeatedly, and other people paid the price. None of this makes her a villain. The show is very careful about that. She was, in many ways, a victim of the system she was born into, forced into a role she didn't want, denied agency over something as fundamental as whether she wanted to destroy a planet. Her rebellion was genuine. Her love for Earth and for the gems she fought alongside was genuine. But the show also doesn't let her off the hook. And I think that's what makes Pink Diamond such a lasting, strange, fascinating figure in the story. She's not a monster. She's a person who kept choosing the version of a situation that was easiest for her. And the accumulation of those choices did real damage. That's not a villain story. It's just a human story. Or as close as a diamond can get to one. There's another layer to this worth sitting with, which is the relationship between Pink Diamond and the Rose Quartz gems she created on Earth. When she started her rebellion, she created a number of Rose Quartz gems designed to look like her Rose Quartz persona, as part of the rebel army. After the war, when Homeworld concluded that a Rose Quartz had shattered Pink Diamond, all of those Rose Quartz gems were bubbled. They were innocent. They hadn't done anything. They were simply the same type as the apparent assassin. They stayed bubbled for thousands of years until the revelation in Season 5 that Pink Diamond and Rose Quartz were the same being resolved the charge against them. When Steven encounters them in future, they're people who've missed the entirety of the time between the Rebellion and Era 3, waking up into a world that has changed completely without them. They're Pink Diamond's creations, effectively her children in a way, and they had no idea she existed until the moment they learned everything at once. Steven's relationship to them is immediately interesting. They look like his mother. They're part of the same family tree as his gem, in some sense. And they're people who have enormous feelings about Pink Diamond. Gratitude, confusion, grief, something complicated, that they've had no time to process. Rosebuds in future handles this with real care, but it doesn't resolve everything. It opens a conversation that the show acknowledges is long and difficult and doesn't pretend otherwise. What Pink Diamond left behind is not just the chaos of the war and the aftermath of the corruption. It's a constellation of beings whose lives were shaped by her choices without their consent, all of them in various stages of trying to figure out what that means. That's not a villain's legacy. It's something more complicated and, if anything, more true. One of the things the show does that I find genuinely unusual for any medium, not just animation, is that it tells you a character's story almost entirely through the way other people remember her. Rose Quartz is the defining presence of the show from the very first episode, and she never actually appears in the present tense. Everything we know about her is filtered through someone else's version of her. The problem with that is that people's versions of Rose don't entirely agree with each other. Pearl's Rose is the most romantically elevated, a revolutionary, a leader, the love of her life in a way that Pearl never quite moves past even millennia later. Pearl's Rose is noble and intentional and always, at some level, right. You can hear it in the way Pearl talks about her. There's a reverence that comes across even in mundane moments. Pearl built her entire sense of self around Rose Quartz for an extraordinary length of time, and it shows. Garnet's version is somewhat cooler. Garnet trusted Rose's judgment. Garnet was won over by the rebellion early on, and she committed to it. And she understood Rose as someone whose instincts for what was right were reliable. Garnet's relationship with Rose was one of mutual respect between two beings who both understood what they were doing and why. It was maybe the most peer-to-peer relationship Rose had with any of the crystal gems. But Garnet's version of Rose is also, in its own way, an abstraction. The person Garnet describes is more of a moral compass than a person with contradictions. Amethyst has a simpler relationship to Rose's memory, and in some ways a healthier one. Rose found Amethyst emerging from the beta kindergarten, 500 years late, smaller than she should have been, a gem that by Homeworld's standards was defective. Rose treated her like she was wonderful. That's the core of Amethyst's relationship to Rose's legacy. And it's quite pure. For Amethyst, Rose is the person who saw her clearly and liked what she saw. That's what Amethyst needed Rose to be. And it's what Rose was, as far as Amethyst knew. Greg's version is the one I find most interesting, partly because Greg is, of all the people who loved Rose, the most honest about the complications. He knew she had enormous blind spots. He called her on them. Their relationship, beautifully told across a handful of flashback episodes, began with Rose being genuinely strange in her interactions with humans, not unkind, but odd. Not quite understanding what human emotional dynamics required. Greg pushed back on that. He asked her to engage with him as an actual person rather than as a fascinating curiosity. And she did. She learned. Their love story is, unusually for the kind of show this is, genuinely mature in its portrait of two people who have to work to understand each other rather than simply falling together. But even Greg didn't know the whole truth. He didn't know Rose was Pink Diamond. Ruby tells him at some point in Steven Universe future, and his response is quietly remarkable. He says it doesn't change how he felt about her. He knew her as Rose Quartz. She knew him as Mr. Universe. Both of them were, in some sense, not quite who they said they were. And he's at peace with that, in his way. The fuller picture of Rose Quartz, assembled across 5 seasons and a limited series, is of someone who was capable of extraordinary love and also capable of extraordinary evasion. She put Bismuth in a bubble rather than openly disagree with her about the ethics of shattering. Bismuth had been one of her closest friends during the rebellion, a foundational member of the Crystal Gems, someone who'd fought alongside her through years of genuine sacrifice. And Rose poofed her and locked her away and told no one, because she couldn't face the conflict. That's not a villain's action. But it's not a hero's action either. It's a person avoiding a hard conversation in a catastrophically disproportionate way. The video Rose left for Steven is one of the show's most carefully constructed pieces of writing, and it's worth thinking about it for a moment. She tells him that she's given up her physical form to create him. She says she wanted to have a child. She says she wants to give him something, though she doesn't quite know what. She says every moment he loves being himself, that's her loving him. It's beautiful and warm and full of what sounds like genuine feeling. And it's also, if you watch it knowing everything the show later reveals, full of omissions. She doesn't tell him she was Pink Diamond. She doesn't tell him about Bismuth. She doesn't tell him about Spinel, who was still standing motionless in a garden at the time of that recording. She doesn't tell him about any of the things she did that she wasn't proud of. The video is honest about Rose's love for Steven. It's much less honest about Rose herself. The show's handling of this is, I think, one of its best moves. It never asks you to stop loving Rose. It never frames the revelations about her as a betrayal of the audience's investment in her. It just quietly shows you that the person everyone loved wasn't quite the person everyone thought they were loving. And it asks you to hold both things at once. The love was real. The evasion was real. The damage was real. These things coexist without canceling each other out. There's a moment in the show, I think it's in A Single Pale Rose, or near it, where Pearl describes what it was like to be in a conspiracy with Pink Diamond for thousands of years, carrying a secret of that magnitude for all that time, ordered to never speak of it to anyone. And you realize that Pearl's devotion to Rose, which always read as love, was also deeply tangled with an impossible burden. Rose asked her Pearl to carry the knowledge of who she really was, alone, for millennia. And Pearl did it, because Pearl loved her. That's a very honest portrait of a complicated relationship. The show earns it by never pretending Rose was simply good or simply bad. She was someone who meant well, mostly, and whose good intentions had an extraordinarily high body count of a kind. There's something specific I want to add here about the way the show handles the revelation of Rose's true identity. The moment in A Single Pale Rose when we finally understand that Rose Quartz was Pink Diamond. The show had been building towards something for years. Fan theories about Rose's identity had been circulating since very early in the series. The revelation was anticipated by a large portion of the audience. And yet, the scene lands with weight anyway. That's because the show understood that the reveal isn't the point. The point is what it means for Pearl. The revelation happens inside Pearl's gem, accessed by Steven and we watch Pearl's perspective on the moment Pink became Rose, the staging of the shattering, Pearl disguising herself, Pink's terrified and exhilarated face as she became someone new. It's Pearl's memory we're watching. Pearl's experience of a decision she agreed to carry in silence for decades that became centuries, that became millennia. The shock isn't that Rose was Pink Diamond. The shock is understanding what that cost the person who helped her. Pearl is arguably the show's most complex character, though Garnet gives her serious competition for that title. Pearl began as a being with no identity outside of service, created to serve a diamond, existing within a very specific social role. Rose gave her the possibility of something else. Rose told her that she had value beyond function, that she was more than her purpose. That message was genuine and it was transformative. It was also delivered by someone who never quite reckoned with how much of Pearl's sense of self became dependent on Rose, rather than developed independently. You can liberate someone and also inadvertently create a new dependency. The show doesn't judge Rose for this, but it doesn't ignore it either. The relationship between Rose and Bismuth is perhaps the starkest example of where Rose's combination of genuine conviction and strategic evasion went most wrong. Bismuth was her friend, a real friend in the way few relationships in the show are, built on years of shared purpose and mutual respect and genuine affection. And Rose ended that relationship unilaterally, in secret, without telling anyone, and kept it ended for millennia. Whatever Bismuth's relationship to the breaking point turns out to be morally, she deserved better than that. She deserved a conversation. She got a bubble instead. When Steven unbubbles Bismuth and has to navigate the same conflict, you understand why Rose did what she did. Bismuth, in that moment, is frightening, operating from a place of enormous, unresolved pain. Steven poofs her and rebubbles her, briefly. And then he does what Rose didn't do. He tells the others. He brings it into the open. He has the uncomfortable conversation. That's not a condemnation of Rose. Steven had the advantage of her example to learn from. And learning from your parents' mistakes is one of the oldest stories humans have. But it is an honest comparison. One of the things the Steven Universe fan community became very good at, very early, was noticing visual patterns in the character design. The show is meticulous about this in a way that rewards close watching. And one of the patterns people noticed was the gem placement on pearls. Pearls in gem society are customizable servants, created to serve specific gems, their design echoing the gem they were made for. Yellow pearls, gem mirrors, yellow diamonds. Blue pearls, gem mirrors, blue diamonds. The aesthetic correspondence is consistent and deliberate. So people naturally looked at the pearls associated with pink and white diamond and expected to find the same pattern. What they found was backwards. Our pearl, Steven's pearl, Rose's pearl, the pearl who has been a central character since episode 1, has her gem on her forehead. White diamond has her gem on her forehead. The correspondence would suggest our pearl was made for white diamond, not pink. And white diamond's pearl, the eerily silent, blank-faced pearl who spends most of her white diamond scenes simply standing in the background without expression, has her gem on her navel. Pink diamond had her gem on her navel. The correspondence would suggest white's pearl was made for pink. The theory that emerged from this was, in retrospect, essentially correct. White diamond took pink's original pearl as a punishment, as a way of asserting authority, or expressing displeasure, or simply because she could. Pink's pearl was replaced with a new one, a default pearl, as the show eventually calls her, and Pink's original was placed under White's control. The show confirmed this, eventually, quietly, in the way it tends to confirm things. Pink Pearl, the pearl who was originally made for Pink Diamond, is the pearl we see serving White Diamond for most of the show, standing behind her, speaking in White's voice, essentially hollowed out by years of White Diamond's influence. She's one of the more quietly disturbing background presences in the whole series, once you know what you're looking at. The further question, how did Pink Pearl get the crack across her right eye, gets addressed in Steven Universe Future, in an episode called Volleyball. And the answer is one of those moments where the show does something unexpected and keeps doing it. The assumption, for a long time, was that White Diamond had caused the crack. She took Pink's pearl and presumably wasn't gentle about it. That reading would make White Diamond straightforwardly villainous in yet another way, which the show was clearly building toward in Season 5. But the crack came from Pink Diamond, specifically from the scream Pink let out when her requests to spare Earth were being denied. A scream of genuine anguish and frustration, uncontrolled, and powerful enough to crack the gem of the pearl standing beside her. Pink didn't intend to hurt her, she was overwhelmed. But she did it. And the crack has been there since, and it fundamentally reframes that part of the story. Pink wasn't only a victim of the diamond's indifference, she was also capable of being the source of damage, even to the being she was closest to. Our Pearl's story is, in some ways, the most poignant mystery the show leaves largely unexplored. We know she was made for Pink as a replacement for the Pearl who was taken. We know she eventually became Pink's co-conspirator in the faking of the shattering, that it was Pearl, disguised as Rose Quartz, who appeared to shatter Pink Diamond before the eyes of the gems present, including Eyeball the Ruby, who would spend all those centuries insisting she'd witnessed the truth. We know Pearl loved Rose in a way that defined her existence for so long it became her entire identity. What we don't quite know is when or how Pearl's relationship to Pink shifted from servitude to love. The show gives us glimpses, a few flashback moments that suggest a growing closeness, a sense that Pink treated Pearl more as a friend than a servant. But the full emotional history of that relationship is one of the show's conspicuous silences. We see the result of it, a Pearl who is devastated by Rose's loss even millennia later, who builds her identity around being Rose's champion, who has to very slowly and carefully construct a sense of self that doesn't depend on Rose existing, but we see relatively little of how it began. Now We're Only Falling Apart, which is the episode that reconstructs the faking of the shattering from Pearl's perspective, is one of the show's most beautiful and devastating pieces of storytelling. It answers the structural question, what actually happened the day Pink Diamond appeared to die, while leaving the emotional question, what it cost Pearl to do what she did, and to carry it alone for so long, mostly to the imagination. There's a version of Steven Universe that spends a lot more time in Pearl's history. I understand why the show didn't make that version. The story it chose to tell was specifically Steven's, and it stayed true to that. But every now and then you catch a glimpse of how much is in Pearl's past that we'll never quite see, and it's one of the more genuinely bittersweet edges of the show. The question of what Pearl was like before Rose is one of those glimpses. We're told she was made as a default Pearl, a replacement for Pink's original Pearl, with no customization, no specific relationship implied. The default Pearl presumably arrived in the standard Pearl configuration. Obedient, precise, designed to serve without strong, individual personality. And then she met Pink Diamond. And Pink told her she could be more, and she became something. The show gives us the endpoint of that transformation very thoroughly. It gives us almost nothing of the process. What did Pearl think of the other crystal gems? Bismuth, garnet, amethyst. These are all beings Pearl has known for millennia, but whose relationships to her are shown primarily from the outside. What was it like to watch garnet form, to see two gems fuse permanently in an act of love? Pearl clearly has opinions about fusion. Her relationship to it is complicated throughout the show, and the reasons are layered. But the early history of those relationships is largely invisible to us. There's also the question of Pink Pearl, after White returned her in Change Your Mind. We see her, clearly damaged, clearly carrying the weight of all that time as White Diamond's puppet. But her arc after that moment is essentially off-screen. She's present in a few later scenes. She's presumably adjusting to something like freedom. What that looks like, what she and our Pearl might have said to each other if they ever met properly, whether she ever fully recovers her sense of self, all of it is implied and none of it is shown. I don't think the show was wrong to leave it that way. There's something appropriate about the Pearl questions remaining open. Pearl's story is fundamentally about the slow, difficult process of constructing an identity after years of having it defined by someone else's needs. That process isn't quick, it isn't dramatic. It doesn't resolve cleanly in the span of a 5-season series. The openness of it is honest. And there's a later development in the show that adds another dimension to Pearl's arc, which is the moment in Steven Universe Future where she discovers she can fuse with Steven. Their fusion, Rainbow Quartz 2.0, the show whimsically calls it, is something Pink Diamond could never have done. Pink couldn't fuse with her Pearl because the social power imbalance between them made genuine fusion impossible. True fusion requires both participants to be equal in the moment of merging, and a Diamond and her Pearl weren't equal. Rose never fused with Pearl. But Steven can, because Steven and Pearl are, in the context of their actual relationship, peers. She's been raising him and he's been teaching her since the show began. That's a fundamentally different dynamic. It's a small moment in the larger arc of Future, but it's quietly significant. It's the show saying that Pearl and Steven's relationship has become something Rose's relationship with Pearl never quite was. Genuinely mutual. That healing of the imbalance, that movement toward an actual quality of care and respect. That's Pearl's real arc, running underneath all the surface plot. And it arrives, understated, in a single fusion scene that could easily be missed. The mystery girl, or whatever her name turns out to be, remains a delightful open question. The show gave Pearl a reason to reach toward something. A number in her hand, a person who seemed to recognize something in her. What happened next is none of our business, really. Which is sort of the point. Pearl's life from that moment forward belongs to Pearl. Not to the story, not to Rose's memory, just to her. That's a good place to leave it. Pearl's warning about White Diamond is one of my favorite lines in the show, not because of what it reveals, but because of what it doesn't. White is not like us, Pearl says. She's not even like them. Meaning she's not like the crystal gems, which is expected. But she's also not like yellow or blue, which is something else entirely. That line, delivered very quietly in a moment of preparation before Steven heads into what is clearly a significant confrontation, does more to build White Diamond as a presence than almost anything that follows. White Diamond had not left Homeworld in eons by the time Steven goes looking for her. The other diamonds, yellow and blue, seem genuinely uncertain about whether they can persuade her to come to Earth, and they're not uncertain people as a rule. Yellow Diamond in particular is someone who projects absolute certainty about everything. The idea that she was worried about White Diamond's reception is telling. When White Diamond does appear, she's enormous, significantly larger than yellow and blue, who are already enormous by any measure. And she emits light so intensely that her gemstone is essentially invisible for most of her early scenes. The show eventually shows it clearly. It's a brilliant cut diamond on her forehead, the same shape as Pink's gem but oriented differently, which is a detail Rebecca Sugar put in a piece of promotional art and a Hot Topic t-shirt before it was visible in the show, because the show just couldn't light the scene to make it legible. It's the kind of thing that makes you appreciate how much thought went into even the cosmetic details of this world. She believed Steven was Pink Diamond for a long time. Or she told herself she believed that. Watching White Diamond and change your mind with that in mind is an interesting exercise. There's something in her behavior that suggests she wanted to believe Steven was pink more than she actually believed it, that the alternative was a reckoning she'd been avoiding. When she extracts Steven's gem and it produces not Pink Diamond, but an empty Steven, the moment isn't triumphant. It's horrifying in a very specific way. The horror of getting what you asked for and discovering it wasn't what you needed. Her breakdown is one of the more genuinely strange things in the show. I'm supposed to know better. I'm supposed to be better. I'm supposed to make everything better. It's the vocabulary of perfectionism pushed to a point of collapse. A being who has based her entire identity on having no flaws, encountering the unavoidable reality that she does. It's called adelophobia, the fear of imperfection, and the show uses it to frame White Diamond not as simply evil, but as a deeply damaged being whose damage happened to have catastrophic effects at the scale of an entire civilization. Now, the fission theory, This is one of the fandom's more ambitious pre-reveal theories, and it never got officially confirmed or denied, which means it's technically still on the table. The idea is that White Diamond didn't always exist in her current form, that she used to be more complete, more whole, more full of the qualities that the other diamonds eventually embodied. And at some point, for reasons the theory usually attributes to her obsession with perfection, she divided herself. She extracted her emotional capacity, grief, warmth, creativity, energy, and gave those qualities form as the other diamonds. Yellow got drive and logic. Blue got emotion and grief. Pink got imagination and care. And white kept whatever was left after those qualities were removed, which is apparently whatever produces someone who is very bright, very powerful, and profoundly hollow. And the evidence people cite for this is mostly circumstantial but not without interest. Yellow, blue, and pink together form something like a complete personality. The range of emotional experience distributed across three beings. White, alone, is peculiarly empty by comparison. Her color scheme is technically every color at once, which is what white light is. But the show presents her as colorless rather than all color, which could be interpreted as depicting someone who has extracted the colors from herself. Her arc is specifically about discovering she has an emotion, shame, or guilt, or something like it, that she'd convinced herself she didn't have, which is a strange arc for a being who was always in possession of all her qualities. It makes more sense if some of her qualities were once literally elsewhere. The show also never explains where White Diamond came from in the first place. Her origin is, as the Steven Universe wiki straightforwardly notes, a complete mystery. Yellow and blue were presumably created by some process analogous to how other gems are created. However, that worked for beings of diamond level power. But white predates that explanation. She is simply there, at the origin of everything, holding Homeworld together in her murals. Where she came from, what the first form of gem civilization looked like before White Diamond existed, what the universe was like before the Gem Empire, none of this is addressed. It's one of those questions where the show's deliberate restraint in world building creates a genuinely intriguing space. Rebecca Sugar wasn't making a science fiction show in the hard SF sense. She wasn't constructing a complete cosmology and then cherry-picking the parts relevant to her story. She was building exactly as much of the world as her characters needed to exist in, and trusting the edges of that world to feel appropriately large and unknowable. White Diamond, more than anyone, lives at one of those edges. She's the show's deepest mystery not because there's a secret to be unlocked, but because she represents a kind of authority, and a kind of age that the show wisely never reduces to a simple explanation. Something was before her. She was at the beginning of it all. We don't know what that means, and I think we're probably not meant to. There is one more thing about White Diamond worth sitting with, which is what she becomes in Era 3. The show gives us a glimpse of it in Steven Universe Future, specifically in an episode called Homeworld Bound, where Steven visits Homeworld to understand his own destabilizing situation. White Diamond has, apparently, repurposed her ability to possess other gems into something like therapy. She allows other gems to take possession of her, briefly, so they can access their own suppressed self. It's a reversed application of her most terrifying ability, turned toward healing rather than control. It's a genuinely strange image. The supreme authority of an entire civilization, now sitting in something like a therapist's chair, processing trauma with beings she once ruled absolutely. The character who represented the most extreme form of gem conformism, the insistence on perfection, the terror of flaws, now engaged in the work of helping other gems access their own imperfection and find it survivable. The show doesn't sentimentalize this. White Diamond is clearly still adjusting. She's clearly still uncomfortable with being she once considered beneath her. Her social skills in the new era are awkward in a way that's recognizable as someone trying to act differently than they instinctively want to. But she's trying. That's the show's verdict on White Diamond. She was wrong in ways that caused incalculable harm, and she is genuinely attempting to change, and those two things are both true at once. What the show is uncertain about in Poe, and what I think it should be uncertain about, is whether that attempt is enough. The harm White Diamond caused wasn't personal, it was civilizational. The caste system she ran, the gem empire that operated on the premise that every being existed only to serve its assigned function, shaped thousands of years of history and damaged thousands of lives. Individual transformation doesn't undo that. Change your mind, yes. Change a lot more than just your mind. The show acknowledges this without quite resolving it, which feels right. Era 3 is a beginning. What it becomes over the centuries ahead is not something any one narrative can answer. The corrupted gems are there from the very beginning. The very first mission Steven goes on with the crystal gems involves dealing with one, the centipedal, who will later turn out to have been a nephrite, a gem pilot, who was trying to get back to her crew at the moment the corruption wave hit. They call them gem monsters, and for the first season or so the show treats them largely as a creature of the week format, a different corrupted gem each episode for the crystal gems to manage or contain. But the show is doing something more considered than that. Each encounter with a corrupted gem is adding to a picture that eventually becomes very clear. These are not animals or demons. They're people. They're gems who had their minds taken from them by a weapon they never saw coming and who have been trapped in monstrous forms ever since, sometimes for centuries, retaining just enough of themselves to be recognizably distressed. Garnet describes corruption as a tear in the mind rather than physical damage to the gem. That distinction matters, and it's one I find genuinely affecting every time I think about it. You can heal a cracked gem. You can bubble a poofed gem and wait for it to reform. But corruption isn't damage to the physical structure. It's something done to the consciousness inside the gem. The gem itself is intact. The being inside it is simply unreachable. Nephrite's description is the one I find most haunting. She calls the corruption wave a song. She doesn't have the capacity to explain it more than that. Her language ability is still largely broken even after Steven's partial healing. But the word song is significant. In the show's musical vocabulary, song is associated with meaning and identity and connection. The idea that the thing that destroyed so many gems' minds was perceived by those gems as a song is a specific kind of terrible. Now here's the thing that the fan community found strange, well before the show addressed it. Yellow Diamond and Blue Diamond apparently didn't know what their attack had done. In Legs from Here to Homeworld, Steven demonstrates to Yellow and Blue what gem corruption looks like by partially healing Nephrite and letting her briefly revert. The Diamond's reaction is one of genuine surprise. They seem to have expected their attack to shatter the gems it hit, or perhaps to do nothing, some kind of final assertion of authority against a planet they were abandoning. They did not expect this. They didn't know corruption existed in the way it did, which is odd. They sent the attack. How do you not know what your own weapon does? The fan theory that makes the most sense to me, and that fits the mechanics the show establishes, is that White Diamond's contribution to the combined attack was the decisive element. Yellow and Blue together can cause enormous damage, but their powers individually are about force and emotional influence. White Diamond's power is different. She can rewrite the internal landscape of a gem, overriding personality and agency. That's what she does to the gems she puppets. Her white light doesn't destroy. It overwrites. When the three diamonds combined their power in grief and rage over Pink Diamond's apparent death, Yellow and Blue expected destruction. What they got instead was something altered by White's contribution. Not shattering, but corruption. Not death, but something arguably worse. And because White Diamond was the architect of it, or at least the determining factor in how it landed, Yellow and Blue simply didn't understand what had happened. They walked away from Earth believing they'd ended things. They hadn't. The healing, when it finally comes in Change Your Mind, requires all four diamond powers combined. Steven brings Pink's equivalent. The other three diamonds add theirs. And the corrupted gems are healed. Not perfectly, not without scars, but healed. Jasper, fully corrupted after voluntarily fusing with a corrupted gem, emerges with horns and teal coloring that weren't there before, markers of what she went through. The corruption leaves traces even after it's been undone. And then there's the cluster. The cluster is thousands of gem shards, fragments of gems who were shattered during and after the rebellion, force fused together inside the Earth's mantle. It's a geo-weapon, designed to grow until it destabilizes and destroys the planet. It's also, it turns out, conscious. In a fragmented and agonized way, but conscious, thousands of disembodied gem experiences fused into something that has awareness, but not coherence. Stephen communicates with it, he enters its mind space and talks with it, and eventually the cluster forms a bubble around itself, containing the pressure of its own formation and preventing the explosion it would have caused. It does this willingly, sort of. It understands that bubbling itself will prevent the planet's destruction, and then it's basically never mentioned again. The cluster is still there, in the center of the Earth, presumably still in its self-generated bubble. The show's Season 5 finale doesn't show the cluster being healed along with the corrupted gems. It's conspicuously absent. The question of what becomes of it, thousands of conscious gem fragments in permanent containment inside a planet, is one that the show quite straightforwardly doesn't answer. In the show's final emotional movement, it's reasonable to assume it was healed, but that assumption is never confirmed. I think about the cluster occasionally. It's a pretty specific kind of horror as a concept. Beings who can't quite be whole because the pieces of them aren't there anymore, forced into proximity and fusion without consent. The show introduces it and resolves enough of its threat to allow the story to continue, but it doesn't resolve the deeper question of what it actually is and what should happen to it. That question is either very sad or very hopeful, depending on which version of events you prefer to believe. The ethical question around the cluster goes somewhat beyond what the show explicitly addresses. Peridot works with Stephen to communicate with it, and what they find is something that wants to form but is too fragmented to do so coherently. It's in pain, in some sense, or it is something adjacent to pain, spread across thousands of shards with no single coherent consciousness to register it. The bubbling it performs on itself is a kind of mercy. It stops the expansion before the explosion, but it doesn't heal the cluster, any more than being bubbled heals a corrupted gem. The healing in Change Your Mind addresses the corrupted gems on the surface. It doesn't, as far as the show indicates, reach down into the mantle and do anything for the cluster. Whether the cluster qualifies as corrupted in the same sense, whether the diamond power applied at Rose's fountain had any effect on it, whether it remains in its self-generated bubble into Era 3. None of this is addressed. It's one of those plot elements that the show needed for one story and then didn't have room for in the next. Another thing the corruption storyline leaves genuinely open is what the healed gems are like psychologically. We see a lot of healed gems in the final moments of Change Your Mind and Scattered Through Future, and they seem, broadly, to be okay. Joyful, even, at the liberation. But they spent thousands of years as mindless monsters. They remember things from before the corruption, apparently. What they remember from during it, whether they have any access to all that lost time, whether the experience left something behind, isn't shown. Jasper specifically had the most extreme version of this experience. She voluntarily fused with an already corrupted gem and became something truly terrible as a result. Her healing carries visible scars, as mentioned. But the psychological layer, what it is to have been inside that experience, isn't explored. Jasper in Future is angry and isolated and clearly processing something. The show gestures at her inner state without ever fully articulating it. I don't think that's a failure. I think Jasper's silence is part of her character. But it does mean this particular thread stays open. There's also Nephrite, who gets the most complete individual portrait among the healed gems. Her memory of the corruption wave, a song, as she called it, combined with her desperate focus on finding her crew across all those corrupted centuries, gives us the clearest picture of what that experience was like from the inside. She remembers her crew. She remembers wanting to protect them. She remembers this song that destroyed her ability to be herself. And then she's healed, and she's Nephrite again, and her crew is presumably out there somewhere in the same situation, all of them waiting to be healed. All of them carrying the weight of a nightmare they couldn't quite be conscious for. The reunion between Nephrite and her crew is not shown. We're told it will happen. But the moment itself, the moment a being who spent millennia as a monster returns to the gems who were her family, is left off screen, which is, in retrospect, probably wise. Some things are too private to dramatize, but the absence of it creates a quiet resonance that stays with you. Healing in Steven Universe is always partial, always incomplete. The show never pretends otherwise. The corruption scars are there because trauma leaves marks. The healed gems are genuinely healed and also genuinely changed. You don't go through what they went through and emerge identical to who you were before. The show understands that, which is why the healing moment is triumphant without being simplistic. Something real happened, it mattered, and the work continues. Steven Universe takes place roughly 5,000 years after the end of a planetary war. That war shaped everyone and everything in the show. The crystal gems' personalities, the state of gem civilization, the existence of corrupted gems, the reason Steven has to exist at all. It is, in the most literal sense, the background to everything, and we see almost none of it. This is a deliberate choice, as Rebecca Sugar has discussed at various points. The show is Steven's story. The war is backstory. She wasn't interested in making a war story. She was interested in making a story about what comes after war, about how people and gems live with what was done and what was lost. The war is the wound. The show is about the wound's effect. That said, the glimpses we do get are remarkable enough that the gaps feel genuinely significant. Bismuth gives us the richest view. She was one of the founding members of the Crystal Gem Rebellion, one of the gems who was there at the very beginning, who built things and fought and believed in what Rose was doing. She is also a gem who came to a different conclusion about what the war required than Rose did. She built the breaking point, a weapon capable of shattering gems outright. Her argument was straightforward. You cannot win this war without being willing to shatter the beings fighting against you. Rose's refusal to use it felt, to Bismuth, like a moral position that would guarantee their defeat. Rose's counter-argument, that the point of the rebellion was to protect life, and that includes homeworld gems who were fighting because they were ordered to and had no choice in it, is compelling. It's also arguably idealistic to the point of strategic self-defeat. They did lose, in the narrow sense. Earth survived, but the crystal gems ended the war with a total of 4 members, none of their original allies, the planet's gems, all corrupted, and thousands of years of isolation ahead. The question of whether Bismuth was right is one the show poses but doesn't fully answer. Steven has to bubble Bismuth himself, briefly, for similar reasons Rose did. Bismuth, in her anguish and disorientation after being unbubbled, tries to shatter him with the breaking point. The cycle echoes. But the show later unbubbles Bismuth properly and gives her a redemption arc of sorts, and the breaking point question isn't really revisited. Was Rose wrong to refuse to use it? Was Bismuth wrong to build it? The show is not ultimately interested in settling that debate, which I think is honest. What gets mentioned but never shown? The battles themselves. The crystal gems and their allies fighting across Earth for 5,000 years. The things they saw and did. The gems who didn't survive the rebellion but who aren't mentioned. There must have been many, given that by the end there were only 4 crystal gems left standing. We see Garnet recounting a simplified version of the war to the off-colors in a late season episode, and it's almost mythological in its compression. The whole thing rendered into a few sentences. There are also the human encounters. The show confirms that gems have been on Earth long enough to have witnessed human history at various stages. A painting visible in one episode appears to show gems in what looks like colonial-era clothing, apparently living alongside humans at some point. The Pyramid Temple which the crystal gems built after the war, is clearly ancient by human standards. Amethyst emerged from the kindergarten 500 years after the war ended. So the crystal gems were on Earth and dealing with their aftermath during significant periods of human history. What they did during that time, who they encountered, how they navigated the business of protecting a planet full of beings who couldn't know they were there. All of it is implied but never dramatized. It's the whole other show that lives inside the edges of this one. I understand why it wasn't made, but I find it very easy to sit and think about. One specific thing that doesn't get resolved. What happened to all the gem ruins? The show visits several over its run, gem structures built during or before the colonization attempt, abandoned after the war, still sitting there in various states of decay and danger. Some of them get addressed, most don't. There are presumably gem ruins all over the world, in places we never visit, from an era of Earth's history that no human knows about. The show leaves the planet haunted in this very specific way, and then doesn't quite explore that haunting. It's a show that contains enormous amounts of story in its negative space. The gaps aren't failures of imagination. They're evidence of a world built carefully enough to have edges that extend beyond the story being told. There's a specific area where the war's history is most tantalizingly incomplete, and that's the question of what happened to the gems who fought for Homeworld and survived. We know what happened to the crystal gems. We know what happened to the corrupted gems. But there were presumably Homeworld gems who were evacuated before the corruption wave and who went on living their lives in the Empire, carrying whatever they knew and felt about a war that ended badly in a place very far away. Jasper is the only one of these who the show really addresses directly. She was born in the Beta Kindergarten, a lower quality production facility that was running at emergency capacity during the war, and she was the only successful gem to emerge from it. She's been defined by the war her entire existence, even though by Homeworld's account she missed the worst of it. She carries the war as identity, as purpose, as the framework that makes her what she is. And then the war's meaning gets rewritten. Pink Diamond wasn't shattered. Rose Quartz was Pink Diamond. The entire premise of the conflict was built on a deception, and Jasper is left holding an identity that no longer has a coherent foundation. That's an interesting story. Future begins to tell it, and the episode count runs out before it goes very far. The Ruby Squad is another example of Homeworld gems whose post-war story is essentially invisible. They were last seen adrift in space, their ship going somewhere, presumably eventually making it back to Homeworld. Do they know about Era 3? Have they been told that Yellow Diamond and Blue Diamond have changed? What do 5 Ruby soldiers, who were loyal and earnest and somewhat clueless, do in a universe where the empire they served no longer exists in the same form? The show introduced them as recurring presences, and then lost track of them in the rush toward the finale. And then, there's the broader question of what the other gems throughout the empire did. The ones on Homeworld, the ones on other colonies, the vast population of beings created for specific functions who have now been told those functions are no longer required and they're free. Freedom is not automatically a gift. For a being who has never had to make a choice about their own existence, the sudden requirement to do so can be as disorienting as any other kind of shock. Future shows this with the gems at Little Homeschool. But Little Homeschool is a small, supported community. The Empire was something incomparably larger. The show was never going to tell that story in full. It was wise to stay with Steven, but the edges of the war, the layers of consequence extending out beyond what we see, make the world feel appropriately heavy. Not in a way that's oppressive to sit with, just in a way that reminds you that the history being drawn on here is real and large and mostly off-screen. One character whose war history is particularly underexplored is Lapis Lazuli. We know she was trapped in a mirror during the chaos of the war's end. Her gemstone cracked, her identity unknown, even to herself, used as a communication device by gems who didn't realize she was conscious. She spent an extraordinary length of time like that. The show is somewhat vague about exactly how long, but the implication is vast. The show tells you this in one episode and mostly moves on. But if you sit with it for a moment, the implications are considerable. Lapis existed aware for all that time in a state of total powerlessness and total isolation. She couldn't communicate. She couldn't act. She could only observe. She watched the crystal gems interact with humans across centuries of Earth's history, unable to indicate her presence, unable to ask for help. When Stephen finally frees her by simply saying hello to the mirror, treating it as though there might be someone inside. It's one of those moments that lands harder every time you think about what it represents. Her subsequent trauma makes complete sense. Her distrust of both Homeworld and the crystal gems makes complete sense. Her difficulty staying in one place, her tendency to flee when things become overwhelming, all of it is entirely consistent with what she went through. Lapis Lazuli is one of the most psychologically grounded characters in the show, which is a strange thing to say about a magical water alien, but it's true. Her arc across the original series is one of the most carefully handled portrayals of trauma and recovery in children's animation, and it's handled with the same quiet confidence the show brings to everything, without clinical vocabulary, without over-explanation, just through behavior and choice and the gradual, uneven process of learning to trust again. What happened to her during the war, specifically before the mirror? What side she was on, what she was doing on Earth, how she ended up in the chaos of the final days is never fully shown. She was presumably a homeworld gem, but her relationship to the rebellion and to the crystal gem's cause is never made entirely clear. The show is content to let that ambiguity sit. Lapis in the present is what matters. Her past is backstory, not mystery. It shaped her. The specifics are less important than the shape the shaping left. I want to come back to Spinel, because I don't think I quite did her justice earlier when we were talking about Pink Diamond. She deserves her own section, not because she's a mystery in the mechanical sense, but because her existence raises a question about Pink Diamond that the show doesn't answer directly and that I find worth sitting with. The question is this: did Pink know what she was doing to Spinel? Or did she simply not think about it? The distinction matters. A person who deliberately abandons someone, knowing it will cause harm, is a different kind of person from someone who acts impulsively and doesn't consider consequences. Pink Diamond, across everything we learn about her, reads more like the second than the first. She was impulsive. She was emotionally reactive. She moved from thing to thing without always pausing to think about what she was leaving behind. The faking of her own shattering, which had world historical consequences she didn't anticipate, is the most dramatic example of this pattern. But Spinel is an earlier and more personal one. When Pink left for Earth and told Spinel to stay, she was doing something she'd done before, removing a complication from her life by the most convenient means available rather than engaging with it honestly. Spinel was inconvenient. She was too energetic, too attached, too much a reminder of a version of Pink that didn't fit the image Pink was trying to project to Yellow and Blue. So Pink told her to stay. Not, goodbye, I'm leaving. Our friendship was real, but I'm going somewhere you can't follow. But a game. A lie dressed up as a game, which is perhaps the cruelest version of it because Spinel trusted the game completely. 6,000 years is not an insignificant amount of time. That's roughly twice the total span of recorded human history. Spinel stood motionless in that garden, in perfect good faith, for longer than human civilization has existed. She didn't know about the rebellion. She didn't know about the corruption. She didn't know Rose Quartz was Pink Diamond. She didn't know Pink was gone. She stood there waiting, and the universe moved around her without anyone thinking to go back. The movie's reveal of Spinel, her introduction, the first moment we see what she's become, is one of the more striking pieces of character design in the show's run. Her original form is goofy and warm, all-rounded shapes and enthusiastic energy, clearly designed to be endearing. The form she shows up in at the start of the movie is inverted, sharp angles where there were curves, an upside-down star on her chest, an expression that went from open and loving to something with a lot of unprocessed pain behind it. The visual shift is doing a lot of work very efficiently. Her arc in the movie is both extremely compact, it's a film, not a season, and quite emotionally coherent. She wants to hurt Steven in the way she was hurt. She's redirected her grief into something actively destructive. And when Steven reaches her, when he actually sits with her and listens to her story and doesn't flinch from it, something changes. Not immediately, not easily, but the emotional mechanism of someone chose to stay and hear what happened to me turns out to be what she needed most, which makes sense. What was done to her was a form of abandonment. The remedy, or the beginning of one, is the opposite of abandonment. Her resolution, going to Homeworld with the diamonds, starting over with beings who are also trying to figure out what they are after the roles that define them have been dismantled, is quietly hopeful. I don't know how she's doing. The show doesn't revisit her in Steven Universe Future in any meaningful way. She gets a brief appearance and then the story moves on. But here's the thing. The show leaves with me about Spinel and Pink Diamond together. Pink's damage didn't happen to one being. It happened in waves. Spinel, Pearl, the corrupted gems who were an unintended consequence of the faked, shattering, Steven inheriting the weight of a person he never met. The pattern isn't that Pink Diamond was a monster. The pattern is that she was someone who kept creating situations she couldn't clean up after herself, and other people kept living inside those situations long after she'd moved on to something new. There's a particular kind of complicated grief in that. You can love someone, understand that they were a person with real limitations rather than a villain with a plan, and still sit with the weight of what their choices cost. The show is very honest about that. It doesn't ask you to resolve it. One thing the movie does that I admire is that it doesn't try to rehabilitate Pink through Spinel's healing. Spinel moving forward, choosing to try again, doesn't retroactively make what Pink did acceptable. The movie is careful to keep those things separate. Pink's actions remain what they were, thoughtless, damaging, irreversible in the ways that matter most. Spinel's recovery doesn't depend on those actions having a justification. It depends on her finding something worth turning toward after the damage is done. There's something Spinel says in the film about not knowing how to be anything other than what she was made to be. It's a line that resonates because it's the question the entire show has been asking from the beginning, just in a much more compressed and painful form. Pearl was made to serve. Amethyst was made as a soldier. Garnet exists as an act of deliberate defiance against what she was made to be. Every crystal gem is in some sense dealing with the gap between their origin and their aspiration. Spinel's version of that question is just the sharpest and most recent. The diamonds offering her a home at the end is touching but also slightly uncertain. They're beings who are themselves figuring out what they are without the roles that define them. Spinel is moving in with people who are doing the same work she is. In some ways, that's more honest than offering her a perfect resolution. It's more like offering her company for the ongoing process. I find that quietly comforting. Homeworld's future, what actually changed. After Era 3, Change Your Mind ends with something that feels very much like a genuine ending. The diamonds come to Earth, the corrupted gems are healed. Pearl, Garnet, and Amethyst regenerate in new forms that carry the history of who they've become. Steven and Connie hug. The beach is full of gems blinking into the sunlight for the first time in millennia. It's a gorgeous, emotionally complete conclusion to years of story. And then Steven Universe Future happened, and the show quietly complicated the question of what resolved actually means. Era 3 is the name given to the period after the Diamond Authority formally disbands. No more empire, no more colonization, no more caste. Gems are, for the first time in the history of gem civilization, free to be something other than whatever function they were created for. Little Homeworld gets built in Beach City, a sort of community hub where gems who've come to Earth can figure out who they are in this new context. Steven teaches a class. Things seem, on the surface, to be going very well. The problem is that thousands of years of a specific kind of society don't just vanish because the authority running it dissolves. Gems who were created for a single purpose, to be a soldier, to be a pilot, to be a pearl, are suddenly in a context where that purpose is supposed to be optional, and many of them have no idea what to do with that. The show handles this thoughtfully in Future by showing individual gems navigating the question of identity with varying degrees of difficulty. Some adapt quickly. Some find that the freedom is more disorienting than liberating. Then there are the Zoomans. The humans living in Pink Diamond Zoo are one of the more genuinely strange elements of the show's world. They've been there for generations. They have no knowledge of Earth as it currently exists. They were taken from Earth so long ago that their culture has evolved entirely within the zoo's environment, and what they know about the outside world is approximately nothing. The show introduces them in Season 4, and then doesn't really engage with the full implications of their situation until Future. When they arrive on Earth, they are completely overwhelmed. Everything is too much, too loud, too big, too unfamiliar. There's an episode in Future dealing specifically with the adjustment, and it's handled with appropriate gentleness, but the show doesn't follow them very far into the process. Dozens of humans who have spent their entire lives in a small, controlled environment suddenly placed in a world that has changed enormously since their ancestors were taken. The full story of their adjustment would be its own series. We get a glimpse of it, and then the show moves on. The off-colors, Lars and the group he found on Homeworld, the gems who were considered defective and were facing destruction, are another thread that ends somewhat abruptly. Lars becomes essentially a second lion, with the same pink hair and the ability to open portals, after his brief death and resurrection in Season 5. He and the off-colors are last seen traveling the galaxy in a stolen ship. Future references them briefly. They're out there somewhere, doing something apparently fine. What that life actually looks like is not shown. Pearl's situation is another open question. The show gives Pearl a moment in a late episode of the original series where she exchanges numbers with a woman named S, a motorcycle riding stranger who shares Pearl's aesthetic in a way that suggests the show is deliberately not quite telling you her name. Pearl, who spent so long defining her existence through devotion to Rose Quartz, finally begins to look toward a life that isn't defined by loss. The number gets exchanged. The episode ends. It's never revisited. We don't know if Pearl called. I find that one genuinely affecting. Not because it's a tragedy, it isn't, but because of what it represents. Thousands of years of grief and then a phone number, and then the show ends before you find out what happened next. It's the most human moment in a show full of them. Peridot and Lapis's relationship ends in a similarly unresolved place. Lapis fled to the moon before the finale of the original series, too traumatized by the prospect of another diamond conflict to stay. She returns for the final battle. She and Peridot are shown together in Future. Their dynamic is warm but slightly undefined. The show implies they've reconciled their differences, but doesn't dramatize it. What their life looks like, what they are to each other in Era 3, where they live now that their barn has presumably been returned to the farmer, all of it is left open. Jasper is perhaps the most conspicuous example. She's healed from corruption in the final moments of Change Your Mind. We see her there, standing beside Amethyst, looking uncertain and overwhelmed. She gets a handful of scenes in Future that are genuinely interesting, mostly showing her isolated on a beach doing extremely intense workouts and being broadly unenthusiastic about the concept of little homeschool. She's a character who spent the entire series as a loyalist to a cause that has now been dismantled. She has no framework for who she is when she isn't fighting for something. The show begins to explore that question, and then the limited episode count of Future catches up with it. And the Jasper arc doesn't conclude in a way that feels fully earned. It's one of the places where the show's abbreviated ending is most noticeable. What happened on Homeworld itself is almost entirely left to inference. White Diamond disbanded the Empire, gems are free. But an empire that vast, with that much institutional history, doesn't transform overnight. What resistance did White's change of heart meet? Which gems adapted easily and which didn't? What does Homeworld look like 5 years into Era 3? The show gestures at these questions without answering them, which is probably the honest choice. These are big, slow-moving social changes that wouldn't resolve on the time scale of the story being told. The ending of Steven Universe is emotionally satisfying in ways that most shows never quite achieve. It's also narratively incomplete in ways that are probably unavoidable, given the ambition of the world it built. Some things were always going to be left open. I'd rather have the honest acknowledgement of that than a tidy conclusion that pretended otherwise. There is one more open thread in Homeworld's future that I keep coming back to, which is the question of gem reproduction. The kindergarten system, the method by which new gems were incubated from a planet's minerals, draining that planet of its geological and biological resources in the process, was the economic engine of the entire empire. Planets were colonized to make new gems. That's what colonization was for. With the empire dissolved and that practice presumably ended, the question becomes, how does gem society sustain itself? Are new gems still being made somewhere? Can they be made without the old kindergarten process? Does gem civilization simply continue with the gems that already exist and gradually contract over the centuries as gems are shattered or otherwise lost? The show establishes that gems can live essentially forever, that they don't die of old age, that they can be healed from almost anything short of shattering. In theory, the population of gems that existed at the end of the war, minus those shattered, minus those corrupted, minus those healed in Change Your Mind, is the population that continues into Era 3 and beyond. No new ones. Just the same beings, carrying their histories into an indefinitely long future. That has strange implications for gem society long term. Not urgent ones on any human timescale, but strange ones. And the show doesn't address them, which is the right call. They're interesting to think about, but not relevant to Steven's story. They're part of the very large world outside the edges of the frame. There's also the small personal question of what happens to the Crystal Temple. Steven gave Greg his room. He drove away. The temple remains presumably with Garnet, Amethyst, and Pearl living in it, as they always have. Pearl has a phone number she may or may not have called. Garnet is Ruby and Sapphire, who have been together in love for millennia and presumably continue to be. Amethyst, who spent so much of the show working out who she was beyond her origins and her perceived deficiency, is apparently doing well. The three of them, and the house and the beach, it's a quiet ending for the crystal gems, which feels right. They've had quite enough drama. I like to imagine them on a Tuesday afternoon. Nothing particularly happening. The beach empty. The temple standing. That image satisfies something. The original Steven universe ends with Steven having solved, or at least substantially addressed, every major external problem the show set up. The diamonds are reformed. The corrupted gems are healed. Homeworld is changing. Earth is safe. By any reasonable measure of what a coming-of-age story needs to do, the show has done it. Steven Universe Future is about what that looks like from the inside. The limited series is doing something fairly unusual for animation, and honestly fairly unusual for any genre. It's a story about what happens when you've been the emotional support for every crisis in everyone's life for years, and you've never quite had space to process any of it yourself. Steven saved the world. Several times. He did it partly through genuine heroism and partly through a kind of compulsive self-abnegation, always putting other people's needs first, always finding a way to make things okay for everyone else. And it worked. And the cost of it arrives in future with some accumulated force. His powers start behaving strangely. His healing ability, which had always been about receiving and giving in equal measure, begins manifesting in ways that are destabilizing. An uncontrolled aura, physical changes he doesn't ask for, a gem that cracks under pressure. The show uses gem corruption as a metaphor for mental health crisis, specifically for the kind of crisis that builds slowly and invisibly until it becomes impossible to contain. Steven's gem doesn't crack because of physical damage. It cracks because of everything he carried without acknowledging that it was weight. There's a moment in future during the episode I Am My Monster. where Steven fully transforms. His emotional pressure reaches a kind of terminal point, and he becomes a monster. Large and pink, and completely unlike himself, the kind of thing the crystal gems would have bubbled in the original series without a second thought. And what saves him isn't a power or a weapon. It's his family staying with him, his father refusing to leave, the people who love him choosing to be present even in the face of something that frightening. It's very honest about how healing actually works. Not dramatically, not through a single epiphany, but through consistent presence and the gradual accumulation of being witnessed and not abandoned. The concept of pink Steven, the entity that briefly manifests when Steven's gem dissociates from his human half, is one of the more fascinating things Future introduces without fully explaining. Pink Steven is pure pink light and force, no personality, no affect, no recognizable humanity. He's Steven's gem expressing itself without the filter of Steven's character. He's also, when you think about it, the closest thing we ever see to a direct expression of pink diamond without the overlay of rose quartz. That pure, unmediated power, pink diamond's energy without any personality to direct it, is apparently what's been sitting inside Steven the whole time, accessible under sufficient pressure. The show doesn't explore what that means for Steven's sense of self with great depth. It raises the question, who are you if you can separate into two distinct entities like that? And then moves on to the business of healing, which is probably the right choice. The question of what Steven is, metaphysically, doesn't need to be answered for the story to conclude, but it lingers as a genuinely interesting, open thread. What the show is most explicitly unresolved about is Steven's future. In the most literal sense, he drives away from Beach City at the end of Future. He doesn't know where he's going. The crystal gems wave goodbye. Greg hugs him. Connie promises to visit. And then he's gone. This is the right ending. Steven spent his whole life living in a space defined by his mother's choices and his family's grief. He was the child of a revolution he didn't choose. He inherited a purpose before he was old enough to understand it. The only thing he's never quite done is figure out who he is when no one needs him to be anything in particular. Driving away is the first step toward that. But it leaves a very large question. Where does Steven go? What does a human-gem hybrid do? When the crisis is over, he ages like a human. The crystal gems don't age at all. He will grow older, and they will stay exactly as they are. That gap between his humanity and their immortality, between Steven's timeline and theirs, is something the show acknowledges but doesn't resolve. And for good reason. There's no resolution. It's simply a feature of what he is. What Steven is remains in some ways the show's deepest question. He's described by Garnet, somewhere in the original series, as being like a fusion of Greg and Rose, of human and gem, of everything both his parents were. He's something new. The show says this explicitly and means it genuinely. Not half human, half gem, as a compromise, but a third thing that is both and neither. What that third thing becomes, what Steven grows into over the decades he has ahead of him, is a question that Future hands to the audience. It's not evasion, it's an invitation. The story isn't finished because Steven isn't finished. He's just started. There's a version of Steven's future that I find genuinely interesting to think about, which is the very long view. Steven ages like a human. Garnet, Pearl, and Amethyst don't. Greg, presumably, ages like a human. Connie ages like a human. The people Steven loves most are divided into two groups with completely different relationships to time. In 20 years, Steven will be in his 30s. The crystal gems will be exactly as they are now. In 50 years, Greg will be elderly and Steven will be middle-aged and the crystal gems will still look the same. In 100 years, assuming Steven lives a full human life, he'll be gone. And the crystal gems will remember him the way they remember Rose, as someone they loved who doesn't exist in the present tense anymore. The show doesn't dwell on this. It's not that kind of show. But it is a show that has always been honest about the cost of the things it portrays. And this is a cost that comes with what Steven is. He's partly human. Humans end. The crystal gems will carry that loss the same way they've carried every other loss, with enormous endurance and the kind of slow grief that doesn't go away, just gets incorporated. Connie's situation has its own particular complexity. She's a fully human person who has had the most extraordinary adolescence of anyone in Beach City, or arguably anywhere on Earth, and who now has to figure out what comes next. She wanted to be a knight. She wanted to fight alongside the crystal gems. She trained for it. And now the fighting is, more or less, over. She's applying to university. She has a whole life ahead of her that doesn't involve gem monsters or interdimensional travel or saving the world. What does a person do with an experience like that? How do you go from what she did to something ordinary? The show gives her some final episode scenes that are warm and hopeful without answering this question directly. She promises Steven she'll visit. She waves goodbye. She is clearly going to be okay. But the full arc of Connie Mahaswaran, who she becomes, what role the Crystal Gems world plays in her adult life, whether she ends up as a kind of human ambassador to Gem Society or whether she finds her own path entirely separate from all of it, remains to be imagined. I'd like to think she becomes something remarkable on her own terms. She always was heading there. Steven Universe, Future's most lasting contribution to the show's legacy might be the way it changed what the original series means in retrospect. Before Future, the show was a story about a boy growing up and saving the world while discovering who his mother really was. After Future, it's also a story about intergenerational trauma, the way the damage done by people we've never met can shape us, can become part of our structure, can require active work to process rather than simply being resolved by the happy ending. The original series earns the happy ending. Future says, yes, and now the real work begins. That's a more adult reading of the show than it started with. And the show grew into it, honestly. Something Future does that doesn't always get discussed is the way it recontextualizes Greg. In the original series, Greg is a comforting and fairly uncomplicated presence, the human parent who loves Steven simply and reliably, the emotional anchor when the gem world becomes too much. Future complicates this gently. Mr. Universe, the episode where Steven processes his feelings about his father, reveals that Greg's easy, permissive parenting style, the van, the freedom, the lack of structure, came from a very deliberate rejection of his own upbringing. Greg had a controlling family. He left. He decided he would never be that kind of parent, and he wasn't. But in choosing the opposite extreme, he left Steven without a certain kind of grounding that he might have needed. None of this is a condemnation of Greg. The show is very careful with this. Greg is a genuinely good person who loved his son completely. The complications in Steven's situation aren't Greg's fault in any simple sense. But Future is honest about the fact that loving someone completely and parenting them well aren't always the same thing, and that the gap between them can leave a mark. Steven works through this with some difficulty, and with a lot of love. The scene between them, once Steven has named what he's been feeling, is one of the more emotionally truthful moments in the whole series. Greg's position in the world of Era 3 is also quietly interesting. He's a human man who spent years living in a van, who happened to fall in love with a diamond, who raised the being responsible for ending the Gem Empire's expansion and healing thousands of years of damage. And he's now a millionaire car wash owner in Beach City, occasionally attending little homeschool events, having quiet conversations with beings who are thousands of years old. He navigated that transition with an equanimity that is either very impressive or a sign of someone who simply doesn't think too hard about context. I suspect it's a bit of both. That's Greg. There's a school of thought about mystery and storytelling that says unresolved questions are a failure, that if you set up a thread, you're obligated to complete it, that leaving something unexplained is a kind of broken promise to the audience. I don't agree with that, and I think Steven Universe is one of the better arguments against it. The show was made by someone with a very specific relationship to the things stories leave open. Rebecca Sugar, in various interviews and commentary over the years, has talked about the way she was drawn to the spaces in narrative, The gaps between what's shown and what's implied, the characters who exist at the edge of the frame, the questions that are more interesting when you don't answer them than when you do. She was interested in building a world that felt genuinely large, genuinely old, genuinely consequential. And the way you do that is not by explaining everything. It's by making the unexplained feel like it exists, not like it was forgotten. The result is a show with an unusual relationship to its own mythology. The show understands the difference between mystery as a mechanic, keeping viewers uncertain so they'll keep watching, and mystery as a tone, a quality of the world itself. Steven Universe has almost no mystery of the first type. It's not trying to string you along. It doesn't withhold information for suspense. When the show keeps something ambiguous, it's because ambiguity is the honest state of that thing. Ronaldo's conspiracy blog, Keep Beach City Weird, is a lovely example of the show's relationship to its own theories. Ronaldo is a joke character, a local teenager who takes himself extremely seriously as a paranormal investigator and is almost always wrong about everything in the most embarrassingly confident way. But across the show, his theories keep brushing against the truth. He describes gem activity in terms that are wrong in the specifics, but weirdly right in the general shape. He has a post about polymorphic sentient rocks that gets dismissed by everyone around him, and that is, structurally, an accurate description of what gems are. The joke works because Ronaldo is doing the same thing the fan community does, looking at the available evidence and constructing narratives that fit it. The show is gently teasing itself and its audience simultaneously. Correct conclusions, reached through motivated reasoning rather than actual understanding, still look like correct conclusions from the outside. There's a detail about gem design I mentioned earlier, the correspondence between gem placement and personality traits. That was never confirmed by the show, but that is far too consistent to be accidental. Pearl's gem on her forehead, intellectual, precise, detail-oriented. Amethyst's gem on her chest, physical, emotional, intuitive. Garnet's gems on her palms, her primary mode of engaging with the world through touch and action. Peridot's gem on her forehead too, and sure enough, she turns out to be intensely cerebral in the way she processes everything. The pattern holds for nearly every named gem. It was never stated. It was just built in, quietly, as a design principle. That's the kind of thing you discover on a rewatch. It's also the kind of thing that makes you trust the show. The sense that there's genuine intentionality even in the elements that aren't underlined or explained. If that much care went into the visual design, what else is there that rewards attention? The show's legacy in the fan community speaks to this. Years after the finale, people still rewatch it and notice new things. The theories haven't stopped. Some of them are now obviously wrong, given what we know. Some of them remain interestingly viable. A few of them turn out to have been more right than anyone realized at the time. The world Rebecca Sugar built is large enough that it continues to generate questions after the story's done. And that's not a failure of closure. That's the mark of a well-built world. There's a specific quality to the show's silences that's worth naming. In a lot of serialized storytelling, gaps in explanation feel like the story has forgotten something. The plot needs A to connect to B, and instead it skips directly to C, and you feel the absence. Steven Universe's silences don't feel like that. They feel like the show knows exactly what's in the gap and has chosen not to say. There's a confidence to the omissions. You sense the shape of what isn't there. The foreshadowing is the most obvious evidence of this. The show plants things in the background of episodes 2 or 3 seasons before they become relevant. The mural of Pink Diamond, seen briefly in a season 2 episode, doesn't resolve until season 5. The split silhouettes of Ruby and Sapphire, visible in a season 1 fusion sequence, won't be understood until those characters are properly introduced. The detail that Garnet wears 2 gems, one on each hand, is a clue sitting in plain sight from the very first episode. None of this works unless someone planned it from the beginning. The gaps are gaps in what the audience knows, not in what the show knows. Fusions are another element where the show has a lot of material it never fully develops. the rules of fusion, who can fuse with whom, what determines the nature of the fusion, why some fusions are more stable than others are partly explained and partly left to intuition. We know fusion between gems is intimate, that it requires harmony and willingness. We know human gem fusion, Stevani, is possible. We know from Future that Steven can fuse with other gems in ways that Pink Diamond apparently couldn't. But the mechanics are soft and intentionally so. The show isn't interested in hard rules for fusion. It's interested in fusion as a metaphor for what it means to be in genuine relationship with another person, and metaphors don't have clean rule sets. There's also the question of what happens when fusions are very old. Garnet has been fused continuously for millennia. What does that mean for the individuals inside? Ruby and Sapphire can and do diffuse periodically. They clearly retain their individual identities and personalities. But they've also spent millennia as something larger than themselves. How much of who they are as individuals is shaped by the fusion? How much of the fusion is shaped by who they are individually? The show touches on this in a few episodes and then leaves it. It's one of those questions that seems like it has an interesting answer and probably doesn't need to be stated outright to be understood. What makes all of this work? The silences, the incomplete threads, the things implied but not confirmed? Is that the show has an emotional spine that remains consistent throughout. The world may be ambiguous about its own rules. The characters are not ambiguous about what they mean to each other. That's the anchor. You can trust the emotional truth of the relationships even when you're uncertain about the cosmological details. And in a show about how love shapes who we are and who we become, that's the part that needed to be solid. Rebecca Sugar built something that will be rewatched and discussed and theorized about for a long time. Not because it left things deliberately unfinished, but because it built something genuinely large enough that no single viewing can contain it. Large enough that the community that grew around it found the space to be worth living in. That's not a common thing. I don't think it should be taken for granted. One small observation to close this section with, which is about the show's music. Steven Universe is, at its core, a musical. Not in the sense that characters break into song as a stylistic device, but in the sense that music is how the show thinks. It's how it processes emotion. The songs are not interruptions to the narrative. They are the narrative at the moments when the narrative most needs to be felt rather than understood. It's over, isn't it? Pearl's song about grief and the impossibility of competing with a memory lands the way it does because it doesn't explain Pearl's psychology. It demonstrates it directly in the way only music can. You hear it and you know something that you couldn't have been told. The same is true of Here Comes a Thought, which is about mindfulness and anxiety, and the way an intrusive thought can spiral if you let it, and the way it doesn't have to. And which became something of an anthem for people watching the show who recognized exactly what Stevani was experiencing. Rebecca Sugar has been open about her own mental health journey and the way it shaped what she wanted the show to say. The musical moments are often where that personal investment shows most clearly. They're where the show stops being a story and becomes something more immediate. What does it mean that the show communicates its most important emotional truths through music? I think about this sometimes. Maybe it just means it was made by someone who processes the world that way, and who trusted her audience to do the same. Maybe it means that some things, grief, love, fear, the slow process of becoming more yourself, resist being talked about and can only be sung. The show chose to sing them, and the songs have stayed with people in the way that music tends to stay, resurfacing at unexpected moments, carrying the weight of the feelings they were written to express long after the plot they accompanied has faded. That too is something worth sitting with. What the show leaves you with, ultimately, isn't a set of answered questions or a sealed mythology. It's a relationship with a world that feels real and still ongoing, even though the narrative is finished. The characters are out there somewhere, Steven on the road, not yet knowing where he's going. The crystal gems in the temple, Spinel on Homeworld, probably still adjusting. The off-colors flying through space, the zoom-ins somewhere, slowly figuring out what weather feels like. The story ended. The world didn't. That's the thing about stories told with genuine care. They don't quite finish. They just stop narrating. There's easily another few hours here if we kept going. We haven't talked about Garnet's history in any real depth, about what it was like for Ruby and Sapphire to be the first permanent fusion, to define their entire existence by a choice that Gem Society considered an aberration and an offense. There's a whole story in how they navigated all those centuries before the rebellion, living as something Homeworld didn't have a category for. The show gives you the present of their relationship and the emotional logic of it, and trusts you to understand the weight of what they chose. But the detail of it, what it was like, year by year, century by century, is just implied. We haven't talked about Amethyst's emergence. 500 years late, smaller than standard for a quartz, alone in a kindergarten that was already abandoned. The crystal gems found her, eventually. Rose found her. But there were 500 years in between that and the end of the war. 500 years of a world she wasn't designed for yet. A kindergarten full of the marks of gems who left before she arrived. What that does to a person's sense of belonging is something the show explores beautifully throughout its run without ever quite putting it into a single scene. We haven't touched on Peridot's arc in the proper depth it deserves. The journey from a rigidly functional homeworld technician completely committed to the Diamond Authority's hierarchy to someone who grows vegetables on Earth and has emotional attachments and opinions about television. That arc is one of the show's most quietly funny and most genuinely moving character studies. The moment she discovers she has ferrokinetic powers, powers she'd been told she shouldn't have, powers that Homeworld might have deliberately suppressed in newer gems, a small moment but a very meaningful one. She was lied to about what she was capable of. She discovers the truth through an act of impulse. That's a very specific kind of liberation. There's Onion, who I don't think anyone fully understands, including the show. He exists in a register of uncanny weirdness that the show appears to find as genuinely inexplicable as everyone else does, and I appreciate that about him. Not everything in Beach City has an explanation. Some things are just ambient strangeness, part of the texture of a world that's used to the unusual. And there are the pebbles, the small gem creatures that Pink Diamond created, who appear in one episode, are treated with real warmth and then are essentially never addressed again. They're small and strange and apparently content. I hope they're still content. I like to imagine them in Pink Diamond's room in Era 3, going about whatever it is they go about, unbothered by the fact that the world changed completely around them while they were in there. But I think that really is enough for tonight. We've been through the big mysteries, the ones that were always going to remain open, the ones that got resolved in satisfying ways, the ones that feel like loose threads left by circumstance rather than intention. We've spent some time with the characters who carry those mysteries in their history. We've thought about what it means to build a world large enough that it still has edges after the story is finished. Steven Universe is a show that rewards this kind of gentle, aimless attention. The kind you have late at night when you're not trying to solve anything, just letting things be interesting. It was made with that quality in mind, I think. It was made to reward the person who sits with it quietly, who doesn't demand answers, who finds the questions themselves to be good company. That seems like a reasonable way to end a night. Good night.